tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
Welcome to the Thinker Sensitive podcast. This is Chad Graham, and today I'm here with Pastor Phil Steiger, pastor of Living Hope Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and adjunct professor at Southwestern Assemblies of God University. Phil, thanks for being on the show with us today.
Really happy to be here.
Today, I'd like to talk to you about the concept of progressivism. Progressivism is the support for or advocacy of improvement of society by reform. It's common today to hear of progressives as a reference to the far left of our American political spectrum. A lot of people would term ultra-liberal groups as progressive groups. Why do you think the left has a market on the term progressive in 2018?
You know, it's a really interesting history, I think. When you take a look at American politics the last 100 to 120 years or so, you go that far back and you have people from the major political parties, Republican, Democrat, claiming the label of progressive one way or another. And you're right that inside of that system there was this structural desire for movement or change, paying attention to things that maybe they thought hadn't been paid attention to, changing social and moral structures and orders of things. What I believe happens when you track that history through time, really in the last 100 years or so, is that there is something inside of the internal logic of progressivism that moves it to the political left. Oftentimes today, we will use the phrase secular progressivism as a substitute for just the term progressivism, because inside of that internal structure is this desire to move away from what they perceive to be the dominant cultural structural order, which was dominated by the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West. So we begin to sever ourselves from theological and ecclesiastical authorities. Mm-hmm. And when you start doing that, you're going to sever yourself from theological authority, from the authority of the existence of God, His will, His character, and nature, and so forth. So the political left in Europe and in America in the last 200 years is very comfortable with that. The political right in the Western English-speaking world is less comfortable with that. So you've got this movement away from theological order and authority because I believe of some of the internal logic that's just built into progressivism. We want it to change. We want to get away from what this is. And so it lands very comfortably in the political left today, I think.
And it's always popular to think in terms of out with the old and with the new.
Yeah. That's
always going to be a popular opinion at some level. Why do you think the current understanding of the progressive camp is problematic, and why should we even care about it?
The word itself is the kind of thing that we use so often we don't reflect upon, and so it turns into a Trojan horse. So you've got this system that claims the title of progressive. We're moving forward in our moral structure and societal structure and so forth. But having already disconnected itself from any sense of objective, especially theological authority or created order inside of the human person, you've disconnected yourself from the end game, from the goal, that to which we progress. Logically, you cannot talk about moral progression without a goal, without an end game. So you get rid of that and you don't have progress. What you have is just change. So if you can imagine watching the Olympics, and you're watching one of the races, and the gun is fired, and they start at the starting line, and everybody knows they're trying to beat each other to the finish line. So they're literally running in the same direction to get to the same place, right? Well, if you can imagine a progressive Olympic race without an end game, you fire the gun, and it feels like a Monty Python sketch to me.
Yeah.
Everyone just starts running in their own direction, right? Uh-huh. So you've got change, you've got movement. People are doing stuff, they're going places, but there's no progress.
Yeah.
And so when you remove that objective standard, then you become your own internal objective standard. So we've gotten to a place now in the Western world and in American politics and culture where progressivism has become its own moral standard, which is why it feels like the goalposts are moving all the time because they can't but move all the time. So the sexual revolution, the same-sex marriage after Obergefell, we were told that all we're looking for is the legalization of committed same-sex two-person marriage. Part of the critique of that was, well, there's no internal structure to that to keep it at just, a monogamous two-person same-sex relationship. And sure enough, 6-8 years later, we're in this crazy place where all of human sexuality has just, so the goalposts just keep moving because it's its own internal structure. It's just change and not what we would call moral progress.
Right. And so another way of saying that is that we can't really even measure any of this change toward a quote-unquote progress if we don't have this standard outside of ourselves to move it towards.
Yeah.
How can conservatives do a better job at being for progress? Because the typical stereotype of the conservative is this old fat white guy, who likes things the way they've always been. And there's this idea in our culture today that conservatives aren't ever for progress or for change of any kind. How can conservatives do a better job at being for progress while not abandoning the conservative principle of conservation, conserving the wisdom we have accumulated, the wisdom that we do have today as a result of our history of garnering that wisdom? How can conservatives be better at this?
I think it's such an important thing for us to think about. And I think more and more thoughtful conservatives, Jewish, Christian, secular, are putting real thought into this. As I think about this question, the immediate analogy that comes to me is what happens inside of my heart when I talk about moral progress for my own soul. I know what these standards are, and these standards have never changed, and so I want to conserve a certain kind of moral standard for my own soul. But knowing who I am and how I behave or misbehave or fail to behave, I am constantly falling short of that standard. So I can, with utter rationality, say that I am conserving certain principles and standards from which I am constantly falling or failing to meet. And so I can then most rationally say, I personally need to work on my progress toward these goals that are very good for me. Getting rid of the standards is not good for me. Finding my progress toward those standards is good for me. So I think some of the best conservative thinkers, you go back to Kirk and Burke, and the best conservative thinkers today are doing exactly that kind of thing. We're discovering that we've got these standards that mean this is what it means for humans to flourish. What makes us happy? Well, it turns out that the research shows us that family, friends, faith, and meaningful work, right? That literally makes us happy, makes us more fulfilled. So those standards aren't new. Those standards have been around for a very long time, but we stumbled towards them. Our social structures don't always support them. So to conserve those things that are good for us, now we have to talk about, well, how do we structure ourselves politically, legally, inside of neighborhoods and churches and these mediating institutions so that we can progress towards those standards. And here's where I think modern American Western progressivism just makes the mistake, is that if we're going to make ourselves better, flourish, we have to get rid of the old standards. Whereas, well, the only way to progress is to hang on to those standards and make our way towards them.
And so maybe some of the change that we have to see, or some of the change that conservatives can be for and vocal about and open and forthright about, is the changes we make in ourselves and in those institutions that are local to help us meet the standards we've been failing to meet this whole time. And so oftentimes what you see, in the progressive camp, so to speak, is new, quote unquote, new ideas to achieve old goals. Well, those old goals are set in some standard, some sort of idea of what's normal or what ought to be or what should be.
Yeah.
That's what conservatives are doing as well. They're trying to hold to traditional morals and standards and the idea of the objective good and the common good for society. The way that change and progress is positive in the conservative view is to change our attitudes, our behaviors, our ways of being that haven't allowed us to achieve those desired outcomes in the past.
Yeah.
And so conservatives that are coming up today, I think one thing that, at least I'll speak for myself, one thing that I'm trying to do is find ways that conservatives haven't met their own objectives for society and these institutions, and try to progress towards those old goals in new ways.
Yep. I think one of the mistakes that conservatives sometimes make, and one of the mistakes that's sometimes made in assumptions about conservatives, is that what conservatism is hanging on to a certain cultural structure. Well, you just want to go back to the Jim Crow laws of the South. You just want to go back to, the good old days when slavery was legal. And, so that's a mistake. If any conservative thinks stuff like, we're making that mistake. And what you said is exactly right. We can look back at those moments and say, well, the culture was wrong because it missed the appropriate moral standards. Yeah. I've been reading some of Martin Luther King's sermons lately, and his approach to systematic cultural social change is profoundly rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So this transcendent, unchanging, eternal ethic of love, for him, nonviolence, that meant change for the good. And so there you have, I think in the purest sense of the term, a conservative idea making a change and making progress toward those goals.
That's awesome. That's about all the time we have for today. Phil, thanks for being with us. For those listening, be sure to check out our Thinker Sensitive season on the rise of socialism, available at thinkersensitive.com. You can also find us on iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. I'm Chad Graham. See you next time on the Thinker Sensitive podcast.
For more Thinker Sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com.